Hello and welcome to this module of your online grant training. We will be talking about grant budgeting basics in these different sections of this module. As a quick introduction, in case you haven't been in one of the modules previous to this, I'm a grant professional certified. That's through the Grant Professional Certification Institute. I'm also an approved trainer of the Grant Professionals Association. Doesn't mean I have all the answers. It unfortunately doesn't mean we get all the grants, but it does mean I love to talk about the competencies and best practices in our work. And as we think about what makes us each unique as a grant writer and grant professional, for me, it might be that I started as a grant maker. That's where I started my career before being now on the grant seeking side for more than 15 years. There's something about my work as a grant maker that has stuck with me all the way through these years as a grant seeker. It's the habit of reading the budget first when I review a grant application. It's something I still do now when I serve as a reviewer for grant makers of all shapes and sizes. I always read the budget first. So talking about budgeting within the grants, thinking about the applications, the templates, the stories that they help us tell, it is an incredibly important area of our work that should not be left to the end. It should not be left only to our well-intentioned and amazing colleagues in finance, but really should be a strong collaborative conversation from the very beginning of our process. So we're going to look at understanding budget guidelines. That's what we'll focus on in this section. And then in the other 4 sections of this module, we'll focus on direct versus indirect. We'll talk about matching and cost share. We'll talk about the critical budget justification and budget narrative, and also about what it means to present a position, to present a plan related to sustainability for our projects or programs. But in this section of the module, we're focused on budget guidelines. Well, wait a second, hold on. I think we've got to have a little bit of a chicken and egg conversation here. Which one comes first? Your project budget, your program budget, or is it the grant application budget? Which one are we thinking about first? The answer, this isn't debatable with me, is your project budget. The reason is you should not, no grant-seeking organization should be creating projects and budgets only to go after grant funding. That is not sustainable. That is not scalable. Rather, you need to be selfish in this situation. As an organization, you want to ensure that you're going after project and program funding that is aligned with your mission and vision, not creating something only for the opportunity. So this is a very black and white answer for me. It is about your project budget. That is what you should have first. What that means is that it will take a lot of planning, not only on our part, but on the rest of our colleagues' part as well, in order to ensure that we truly understand the total cost of our project or program. What we're trying to figure out is not, at first, the amount requested column that you see in the middle of the screen. Rather, at the beginning, what we need to make sure we understand and all agree on is the column on the far right, the total project expenses. All of the project expenses for the project or the program that you are proposing. Or maybe it's organizational funding. Maybe you want general operating funding. The total project expense would be your entire operating budget. Regardless, we need to know the total cost against which we're going to request some amount of funding from the grant maker. When you think about how you document this as an organization, I recommend that you have an agreed upon standard template that you use for documenting the total cost of any project or program that you will translate to the grant maker's application form after the fact. It's fantastic if the format you use for documenting project or program specific budgets is closely aligned, if not almost exactly the same, to that of your organizational operating budget. That way, it's very clear how do we go from full organizational operating budget to a specific project or program, and then we can translate to a grantmaker's budget form. It makes the process of coming back and thinking about how what we did with a grantmaker, how does that tie back to our expenses, makes that process much smoother. It also makes it easier to answer questions from grantmakers. If you start with what works best for you, what works best and comes out easiest out of your accounting system, and then translate later. When you're thinking though about this internal standard document format template where you will document a total cost for a project or a program, please don't forget that it's not only about the expense portion, it's also about the revenue portion. Your grant makers will often, not always, but often have templates that require you to show other sources of funding. They'll want to know what is the other revenue that you have for this request. Therefore, you should, in your internal template that you're going to use for documenting the total cost of a project or program, you should also document what do you have committed for the project or program, and what do you have as pending. What are requests that you have made to individuals, to corporations? What are pending grant applications that you have for this project or program? Those should all be documented on that same basic form so that ultimately you can translate them to the grantmaker form once your internal document is agreed upon by the team. Part of why it's important that we know and are selfish a bit about our costs first is so that we can translate only the allowable, eligible expenses into the requested column. If we know all of our costs first, then we can follow the directions, follow the guidelines of the grant makers to understand what is it that they are willing to fund. How do they like to see information presented? Do we need to separate personnel from non-personnel? Are there line items that we track for our budget that don't align to their form? Maybe we need to consolidate 2 or 3 of ours. We will have our high level of detail, and then we can, sometimes I joke, turn ourselves into pretzels, right? We have to form ourselves and our budget into the form that is important to the grant maker. But that's okay. It's not too hard to do that if we know our total cost and our total committed and pending revenue in advance of doing that. If we think about having our internal document, our internal details already agreed upon, not just by the grant professional, not just by the finance team, but also probably someone from programs, at least those 3 would be the legs of a stool holding up our project or program budget. What can we do then? We open up grant guidelines, we find something like this. What do we do now? Well, we can see, first of all, that this programmatic budget, it's going to be worth 15 points. During the review process, our budget will be formally scored and will be up to 15 of our total points when our application is being considered. Okay, no pressure. What do we see next? The annual program budget column. That is, exactly. That is your internal document that you just agreed on. That is your total cost of the project or program laid out in alignment with their form. So that's not too hard. The second blank column is about what funds did you request from this grant maker. That should be based on if they have any restrictions, what are allowable or eligible costs. That should influence our decision. The other thing that should influence our decision is if we have any other committed or pending funds that have already been requested for specific line items or already approved for specific line items. we should place those in the other funding resources appropriately. That way we can see total cost, other funding sources, what's left in the middle. We read from the left in and from the right in, and we figure out what is left that we would ask for support from this specific grant maker. Now, when we read grant maker budget forms, oftentimes the unique forms give us some clues about what is important to the grant maker. What is it that they have as a preference for where their money might go? In this example, we can see that the grant maker has broken their form into personnel and non-personnel. That's an indicator that you might want to look into the guidelines more deeply to see if they have any preferences or limits about how much of their funding is spent on staff. Now, we could get into quite the debate. In many projects or programs, the biggest direct expense is the staff. Without the staff, there's no project or program. So you might want to debate with the grant maker about why they have those limits. It's probably going to be difficult to change their mind. But when we see the personnel and the non-personnel split out in a grant maker budget form, that is the clue that you should return to the guidelines and look to see if they have any caps or limits. If they do, make sure that what you are requesting in that middle column aligns with the cap or the limit. If you don't find anything in their guidelines talking about a cap or limit on personnel as a portion of their request, you probably want to reach out, give them a call, send them an email, and reconfirm. I see that you break out the personnel section in your budget form. Are there any limits that we should be aware of related to how much of our request could support our personnel? Better to be upfront and ask now than have it be denied or have an issue after the fact. Then we can think about what do we have left in the non-personnel section of the budget that we would want to request funds for. In this budget form, there's 2 lines at the bottom that are called out for other. What might be other? It could be for a line item that doesn't perfectly match up with your operating budget. That might be a spot where you would place something under other. If we choose to use that row, we have to make sure we tell them what is other. Don't simply put numbers into that row. That might make you lose a point. When we look at budget forms like this is rather simple. This is not one of the most complex, but certainly doesn't line up with all internal budget forms, so still might take some translation. What does that mean for you? It means that you need to keep careful notes about ways that you modified your internal project or program total cost budget to the grant maker's form so that if they ask questions, you know what did we place where? What line items did we combine? That way we can trace back our steps and answer questions or make modifications if requested. Now, if that last example was one that I said isn't overly complex, what does that make this form? You're right, rather unique. That would be what it makes it. So this form comes from the BJ's Charitable Foundation at a time when their focus was exclusively on food pantries and soup kitchens. And what they did was create a unique, individualized grant budget form, but honestly, the more you dig into it, you realize they did so in order to make it easier for their applicants to tell the story that was important to them, to tell the story that would help them only ask for the things they wanted to fund, maybe even make it easier for them to then track and report. Well, let's think about food pantries, soup kitchens. What would they care about? The number of people served, for sure. So they actually had it at the top of the budget form. So the outputs for the project and program are actually included in the grant budget. That's a little different. If we think about revenue, they had an income sources section. So other revenue supporting the organization, the project, Great, we can document that very basic information. The expense section didn't have all those rows like we saw in our last example. It only had a few, but it did break out what is normally a very generic single line of supplies. And because of the type of organizations that they were funding, supplies for food pantries and soup kitchens, kitchen utensils, gloves, equipment to store food, workbooks for nutritional classes, and food. Food, which is often lumped into supplies, was actually called out as its own row. Why would they do that? They did it so that rather than having one big line of supplies where all these things would go, given who their potential grantees were, they had them break out that one line item. They left all the other expenses, which are still important, still direct costs, still need to be funded somewhere, but not by this foundation. They left them out. That way, all they were looking at were the supply costs, the food costs that they were willing to fund. So it is a very unique form, but they created the unique form to limit some of what the grantees, the potential grantees, would provide, and to keep it within the priorities, the focus of where the foundation wanted to give their funds. Now, grant budgets, what we learn from the templates, what we learn from the guidelines, each form will tell its own story. So if you find yourself opening up a new Grantmaker budget form and you have questions about what does this template mean? How do I translate my total cost budget to this form? By all means, reach out, send me an email, ask some questions. You can do that with my direct email, Diane@dhleonardconsulting.com. Well, we're just getting started on our budget fun here in this module, so I look forward to seeing you in the next section.